Разговорный курс английского языка невозможно представить без слов связок. Фразы связки, они будут по-английски называться linking phrases или linking words, используются для того, чтобы соединять предложения между собой и абзацы между собой. Без linking phrases речь звучит очень бедно, и самое главное, в речи нет категорий fluency и coherency. Fluency — это текучесть речи, когда мы говорим достаточно быстро и плавно, а coherency — это логическая взаимосвязь между предложениями, между словами, между абзацами в тексте. Так как я говорю абзацы, я имею в виду письменный английский язык, то есть когда мы используем английский для письма. Но для того, чтобы писать, допустим, эссе, допустим, там письма, какие-то описания, все что угодно, да, письменный английский язык. Для разговорного английского языка эти слова-связки также важны, потому что нашу речь на слух, особенно если мы даем презентацию и говорим что-то длинное, воспринимать крайне сложно, если мы не используем слова-связки. Мы их разделим на категории. Это начало и завершение мысли. Первая категория. Здесь следующие фразы можно использовать. The former, the latter означает первый, последний.
Unlike the former, the latter is an elected representative.
The book I eventually selected to review seems to lean more towards the former than the latter, only scoring a 2 on Audible's 5-point erotic rating system. Vikings...
Stop substituting the former for the latter.
And of course, we'd like the former, not the latter.
And I feel more on the latter than I do in the former.
My hunch is that it's the former rather than the latter, but I'm certainly not in the business of giving you financial advice as to when to buy and sell houses.
For the former was finished in 1919 and the latter unveiled in 1921.
So the role of government is to maximize the former and mitigate the latter, I would say.
First и secondly, во-первых, во-вторых, это классно используют обычно для списка какого-то аргументов, когда мы говорим подряд несколько вещей, да, first и secondly.
Firstly, it involves the capacity to play with time. Secondly, a futures-oriented curriculum. Thirdly, emotional intelligence.
Firstly, Wellington had not used enough troops, and secondly, he'd used them in detachments.
Of all things is an egg of all things. Firstly, just if it is local, and secondly, just if it does what it says on the tin. That is to say, if it is the hyper egg.
Firstly, you think they're full of orphans, and secondly, you think that it's a good thing, that it's a place, a caring environment for children.
The first point is, во-первых, мы можем сказать дальше, the second point is, the third point is, но это чаще не больше 3. То есть 3 раза можно так сказать, но и то не стоит этого делать. Потому что в разговорной речи, если мы послушаем носителя языка, не будет таких постоянных повторений. То есть они звучат искусственно. Скорее всего, вы один раз скажете, допустим, the first point is, the second point is, а на третьем вы уже используете какую-то другую из разговорных слов, от этих фраз, которые сегодня мы пройдем.
The first point is, whatever I tell you right now is not like an inoculation for life.
So the first point is just that the immune system doesn't own these molecules. They have to share with the nervous system.
First point is that the top line budget request is $27.9 billion.
So the first point is that while we don't expect 100% pass-through of MBS yields to mortgage rates.
So the first point is financial crisis is in and of itself a distinct category of pathology.
The following, следующий.
The following is based on a true story submitted by Captain.
The following is a program of the Santa Barbara County Education Office. To learn more, visit sbceo.org.
Has a history that probably begins in childhood, where one of the following is likely to have occurred.
Foreign Flight Service Unit, also known as FSU. The following is a reenactment of the transcribed radio transmission.
Finally, в конце концов, это уже пошел итог.
And finally, does this new thing that you're proposing that's not a religion but something else, does it need a leader, and are you volunteering to be the Pope?
He finally faced the hatred that had defined his life.
And finally, let's bestow credit in a very generous way.
A mind of clarity, where I could finally see my earthly ways of irregularity.
Okay with it, but then finally when lots of things went wrong and the fact that we were trying to break down this wall between, this barrier between the audience and the work.
In summary, в итоге, to summarize, подводя итог.
In summary, there is no shortcut to making something easy for screen reader users.
So, in summary, our new story could go something like this.
So, in summary, my goal is that this message gets spread to as many aspiring creatives as possible and helps them get their point of view across in a really, really powerful way.
So, in summary, the 1/2 and 1/2, or 1/2 and 2, and so on, correspond to the delta X and delta Y.
And in summary, if you ask people to define our culture, they would say it's a culture of transformation.
To summarize, I think it's important to, if you get stuck, it's important to realize that if you're working on the right problem, and you can reframe it as a very easy way, and I gave you a very easy way to reframe the problem.
Categories will allow us either to introduce or to summarize the other more detailed units that we've had. One reason for making a scroll is when...
So, what one thing to summarise, what top tip, what pearl of wisdom is at the heart of the art of leadership?
Impact. What is impact? Well, I like to summarise that as the price of chips. So how does your research impact on society?
But if you wanted to summarise it, his view, which I share, is that the causes of the gross overrepresentation of Aboriginal children in the juvenile justice system are the multifaceted and interactive aspects of disadvantage suffered by the Aboriginal community generally about.
In conclusion, заключение, to conclude, делая выводы.
In conclusion, how do I intend to apply all of these things to the children I'm going to have with my beautiful wife?
Now, in conclusion, I just want to say this. Martin Luther King once said that when our laws align themselves to equality and justice, then we will have true peace in this world.
I think you'd have to conclude, if you look at the output, who really succeeds by this? Who does everything they should? Who gets all the brownie points? Who are the winners?
To conclude, I want to argue that blackness as a creative urban methodology is most powerfully embodied in the history of black musical cultures in cities from slavery to modern times.
Lastly, наконец.
And lastly, moo breathing helps you remember the sound and the feeling of this breath when it's done correctly.
Lastly, knowing that you've been to hell and back, and not only survived, but you took a horrible situation and decided that you were going to love the people in your life that much more.
In theory, in practice, в теории, на практике.
Land and agricultural labour required to feed its growing population, in theory. In practice, arable land was destined for other purposes, and hundreds of thousands of farmers were forced to migrate, seeking employment in neighbouring countries.
EU member, at least not in theory. In practice, what was Brussels gonna do? Were they really gonna expel the third biggest European economy from the EU?
So I had a whole variety of choices when it came to textiles. In theory, in practice, it came down to what I could actually find that was for sale still today, because obviously they have a lot of things that we don't anymore, and I don't necessarily
allow him to direct the battle in theory. In practice, though, Browning did next to nothing practical when he was actually on the ground. So rather than telling Gavin to change his plans,
Можно использовать любые из комбинаций, которые вам нравятся, но самое главное не путать. Вот особенно вот эту четверку. In summary, to summarize, in conclusion, to conclude. Ну, чтобы не было такого, что вы путаете предлоги, допустим, какой предлог поставить. Потому что изменение предлога влечет за собой изменение смысла и сложность понимания. Это будет неверное, некорректное использование этой фразы. Добавление информации. Здесь первые две фразы у нас одинаково переводятся. Например, это for example и for instance. Но разница между ними в том, не в смысле, а в использовании. В том, что первая фраза for example используется гораздо чаще, чем for instance. То есть большинство людей даже не слышали о такой for instance, что это существует, так как это фраза для более академического английского языка. То есть мы можем в разговоре это услышать между людьми там, в одной специальности, которая находится, или там просто на уровне уже бизнес-английского. Или же academic English, когда мы говорим об обучении, когда нам нужно говорить более солидно. Что, в принципе, я рекомендую ее использовать.
Come to that, but like for example, someone who smokes cigarettes, they're really only going to quit when they go to their doctor and their doctor says, oh, you have emphysema or you have cancer.
They work together in climate change, for example. Organizations like the C40, like ICLE, which I mentioned.
So for example, Scouts are curious. They're more likely to say that they feel pleasure when they learn new information or
work from the government, the universities, and a lot of volunteers. For instance, the SCORE organization is a group of volunteers that support small businesses.
For instance, that a government issued you an ID or that you're over 21.
Measurable. So for instance, when I drive to my first neighbor, if I want to go to my second neighbor, he is 1 kilometer farther.
Namely, а именно
namely the reasons why things went the way they did.
Urged, namely the prospect of exporting sugar to the U.S. tariff-free, some of their descendants shifted positions.
Namely, a relentless drive for economic and technological development, which would increase social alienation and inhibit human freedom.
Namely, that technology is enabling trust between strangers.
And, ну понятно, это и in addition к тому же
tools and more power to, in addition to the way that the venues are marketing the work, that the companies can actually run alongside, and the two campaigns can be integral.
Because they have a broader, deeper knowledge base. In addition, employees make relationships across the enterprise, which strengthens all future projects and can even help with retention.
Furthermore, это тоже к тому же.
And then, furthermore, because that is quite absurd and you're mad at yourself because you do it, you are worried because you worry because you worry.
Furthermore, while geothermal energy is clean and renewable, it's not entirely harmless. Drilling can release vapors containing pollutants. Furthermore, Gödel argues these unprovably true statements exist in every axiomatic system.
And furthermore, they don't resolve those conflicts nearly as well, in part because of a loss of empathy between those two individuals. Second, our reproductive hormones suffer.
In addition to дополнение к,
in addition to at least one suicide and one fatal accident reported on site.
The hundreds of articles, in addition to those that I've written that are published on my website.
So in addition to what these British people did to the native people who were living there for 70,000 years.
Massacres as systematic as those practiced against the Jews in the 20th.
As well as, так же как,
have been working around the clock, as well as a number of other negotiators, to see what would a real cessation of hostilities look like that could provide that humanitarian access and provide people in places like Aleppo relief.
And it had a profound impact on climate as well as many other things. There's Singapore, as it developed its high-rise and its remarkable public housing, all
political as well as our economic systems.
And I do think we should focus on how we're going to try to support more families.
Travel, as well as satellites built to analyze the health of Earth's vegetation or to predict natural disasters.
Also, также и to это тоже в конце предложения. Также мы можем использовать фразы besides, кроме того.
Besides, land without food crops isn't automatically ecologically useless. A beef-free diet would free up around 2 billion hectares. A vegan diet would free up around 3 billion hectares of land.
Besides, I'm fine with that one. Trust me, I'm perfectly capable of...
Use these to help you walk.
And besides, it's very difficult to tease apart the impacts of your culture and the impacts of your language. Even if that result is true, which it's probably not, is the gendered language the cause or the effect?
Apart from, кроме того.
Apart from the fact that they're floating in the sky, is that they are encased in this golden mandorla.
Portrait indoors and probably individually. Apart from initial ideas for composition.
Okay, apart from being home to immense biodiversity, a huge number of indigenous people, and supporting the climate of the entire region, what has that Amazon ever done for us?
As well as friendship and science. What I love about Tracy Chevalier's novels, apart from everything, is that you leave having learned so much, but you're learning it in a way that doesn't feel like you're learning. She weaves fact and fiction together so beautifully, is what I mean, and I applaud that very, very much.
Moreover, более того.
Moreover, today, more than half of the world's population live in cities. In the developed world, it's about 78%.
Moreover, several other candidates have refused to join the group, thus potentially splitting the vote enough to keep Erdogan in place.
Moreover, it becomes increasingly difficult for larger blimps to maintain their shape. So you can't scale up blimps forever.
Moreover, I think it can transform society. Because if enough people do it, we can change society's definition of success.
What's more, более того.
What's more, we offer you workplace learning experiences through our extensive real-world networks.
What's more, solar's gotten 89% cheaper over the last decade, thanks in part to global supply chains for other technologies that use the same materials.
What's more, it gives us a vocabulary to talk about those changes. In fact, it can be helpful to think and talk about all sorts of maybe not technically living things.
What's more, agroforestry has loads of additional benefits.
In short, вкратце.
In short, understanding how emotions are processed can help us come up with solutions that work with the way people think and not against it.
Here, but in short, the worldlings are children and their pet companions that adults cannot see.
In Anatolia. In short, they needed a miracle, which, fortunately for them, arrived in the form of a fast-thinking Italian prince named Bohemond of Taranto.
In short, I found that the CIA and the FBI were stuck. They were unable to escape from old patterns, old ideas, old cultures, and old procedures.
In brief, короче говоря.
In brief, what I'm saying is we need to take the next step beyond what Galileo said.
Definition of liberal education that I will be articulating in these remarks going forward. But in brief, what is it we're talking about when we talk about providing students with a liberal education?
In a nutshell, в двух словах. Фраза in a nutshell — это разговорная фраза, поэтому мы ее используем только в разговоре. В письменном английском фразу in a nutshell использовать не стоит.
And that's in a nutshell why, cinema is an altar. That's why I love immersion, these technologies of immersion.
Organizations within the not-for-profit sector. In a nutshell, my friends, you will have an array of options available to you.
about it already, but in a nutshell, this is SRAM's ETAP access technology, available for the first time on their second-tier groupset force.
So this, in a nutshell, is dark mode. And from here, what I would do is kind of change the exposure just a little bit to get it exactly where I want. Now let me show you.
In a nutshell, there are 3 basic reasons why human bodies, including yours and mine, remain vulnerable to diseases and other health problems today.
И еще хотелось бы сказать, что пунктуационно все вводные слова и конструкции и в русском, и в английском языке выделяются запятыми. Поэтому если вы поставили в тексте moreover, потом ставите запятую и дальше продолжаете. В разговоре нам не нужны запятые, но тем не менее нужны паузы. Поэтому в разговоре вы делаете паузу после того, как сказали moreover. То есть moreover, пауза и только потом следующий текст. Причинно-следственная связь. Due to the fact that — это согласно или согласно тому факту, что. Просто вариант due to the fact that — сразу полная фраза. Если нужно потянуть время, пока вы думаете, что дальше сказать, она идеально подходит. Due to — это если вы уже знаете, что вам нужно сказать, и вам нужно просто быстрее перейти к делу.
Compare that to today, and due to overpumping our groundwater, we have killed the river, and the sponge-like forest that used to line it
is due to the feedback loops between us and our tools, to the degree that our tools become extended appendages that
industry. Due to decreased demand for flights after September 11th, 2001, this became unsustainable.
Minutes that much of that is due to the fact that these technologies are becoming so complex.
Was that it was due to the fact that she was a wonderful actor. She knew when to trust her instincts.
Was only possible due to the fact that he was both willing and able to participate in it.
Owing to the fact that, благодаря тому, что.
Have taken cybercrime cells of countries across the world by storm, owing to its various applications in crimes.
In trouble they are, owing to how much has been depleted. We've taken big chunks out of the machinery.
Owing to the fact that your own master, Dr. Beddington, is the professor who got them here to the Berg in the first place.
Owing to the fact that we were led, of course, by President Wilson.
Owing to the fact that it would be the largest city in the empire, is already the capital city of Mexico, and is the largest city in the entire Western Hemisphere.
Because, потому что вместо because можно спокойно использовать as, так как, потому что because часто очень используется, если его все время вы будете говорить because подряд, это будет звучать очень неинтересно.
And he was easy because he had this beautiful white beard, and I had already named him David Greybeard.
And I got into it because I wanted to help people feel better.
Because of — из-за того, что.
His dreams. And it's because of those words that I stand here right now, full of passion.
Since — с тех пор, как.
And the firm has done spectacularly since then.
Because you have been holding it since this morning, he said.
Size. But I've been drawing ever since I could hold a crayon, really. My mom was an artist, and growing up,
people out of poverty, because that's what we're talking about. Since I was a kid, 2 billion of the least of these, our brothers and sisters, have been pulled out of poverty.
Therefore, поэтому.
And therefore, they're more conservative about changing society for fear of disrupting this organism.
And how they therefore promise to transform our economic systems in radical ways.
That's why. Поэтому.
We might find it too easy. That's why a very common feeling when you're in a museum, let's admit it, is I don't know what this is about. But if we're
Finn. That's why it's not about me or my talents or gifts. He gave me those things so I could use them to shift the focus.
That's why they used to say that the PC, the computer, was the LSD of the 90s, because the computer revolution literalized the dream of expanding our minds.
So, таким образом.
So you're not to think of yourself simply as an individual, but rather as someone embedded in a society.
And so I was looking through the vegetation with my binoculars, and I recognized this as the one chimpanzee who'd begun to lose his fear before the others.
S мы сказали, что это то же самое, что because, в принципе, они взаимозаменяемые практически во всех случаях. Идем дальше. Причинно-следственная связь продолжается. This means that, это значит, что...
Or hertz. This means that over the same amount of time, a high-frequency wave will complete more cycles than a low-frequency one.
Energy poverty. This means that they've gone without heating or power because they can't afford it.
This means that while an individual desert locust lives only 3 months, a plague can last up to a decade.
As a result, в результате...
And as a result, got rid of about 20% of carbon.
Felt better as a result. That same survey
think that you will see that IFAS, as a result of this, will be able to make some significant changes.
As a result, I surrounded myself with dependent people and then would grow resentful of them being dependent.
Но.
But the other thing a nostalgic reactionary mind can do is to say that
artist, but other than that, it was just me and a bunch of guys.
Used to be. But when you ask, do you trust your city councilor? Do you trust your mayor?
However, однако.
And there was, however, one awkward conversation about my lifestyle.
However, fortunately for Dreyfus, his story is not over.
However, they also generate way more drag, making them impractical. This plane...
Although, even though, хотя, или даже если.
Although I actually kind of like that. Private higher education system. And although we do have private schools within elementary and secondary education.
First of all, my childhood taught me that imagination is not a plaything, although it can be, of course.
And nostalgia, even though I love that stuff sometimes, but it's like, we're in 2015, so what are these new feelings?
Appendages that even though they are not within our biological skin tissue, they are nonetheless a part of our cognitive arsenal.
My kitchen, and growing up, even though they were very loving to us, my sister and I.
And so I started to study. Even though I wasn't in college, I was looking for the answer. What happened to the world's poorest people?
Despite the fact that, несмотря на тот факт, что...
Despite being born with the privilege of a native white man.
On one hand, as I say to people, despite the economic picture and despite the view of experts, I'm more optimistic about what can be accomplished in the world and what can be accomplished in business.
But despite the fact that Malassezia colonize everyone to a similar extent, not everyone gets dandruff. Some
in my life, despite the fact that I'm not going outside, I've actually been really enjoying making everyday clothing.
Despite the fact that in the early 20th century, TB caused up to 20% of deaths in large Eastern European cities.
Despite the fact that it emerged from particular sets of experiences and historical circumstances in black urban communities.
In spite of the fact that, несмотря на тот факт, что
In spite of these advances, people kept getting lost.
You'll understand fewer words in spite of the fact that our most common words have Germanic roots.
In spite of her success leading Egypt through this military crisis, she had to work to cement her credibility in the eyes of the public.
I say that in spite of the fact that I'm a principal in a money management firm located about 10 miles north of here in San Mateo.
Здесь вызывает вопрос, в чем же разница между такими похожими вещами, despite и in spite of, или в чем их схожесть? Дело в том, что сейчас это, в принципе, одно и то же, поэтому вы используете то, что вам нравится. Или despite, или in spite. Можно, допустим, в своей речи К примеру, один раз сказать despite the fact that, а второй раз in spite of the fact that. Но нужно обратить внимание на предлоги. То есть, когда вы говорите despite the fact that, тут нет никаких of, нет никаких in. Внимательно с предлогами, не путаем их между собой. Nonetheless, тем не менее.
But nonetheless, as a studio maker, she values her labor. So there is a price tag attached to these noble efforts.
When you snap it together. But this is really cool. Unfortunately, it is stickered pieces. They're not printed, which is a shame.
A myth. A delicious myth, but nonetheless a myth. Regardless of how greasy or absorbent the food consumed is, it's simply taken in too late.
There are rules nonetheless. You have to become a homeowner in Portugal.
Strange at this point, but nonetheless part of the same family.
Torch, nonetheless. And there's one thing you'll notice in all these movies and all these video games, comics and books, ain't nobody wearing protective eyewear.
Nevertheless, несмотря на это или все-таки,
Just Ernest Becker wrote, we are nevertheless housed in heart-pumping, breath-gasping, decaying bodies, simultaneously gods and worms.
And that this kind of element of the non-human coming in, which is nevertheless sentient, is like, can be enough, that can be enough.
Nevertheless, Rockefeller ordered troops to retake the prison.
While, в то время как, несмотря на то, что...
While the conservative stresses the fact that we're embedded. Now, of course, we are both things, but the consequence of this is you get two kinds of political theory.
Taking in tens of thousands of calories while expending very few.
While sparing and being more gentle on the normal cells. A huge breakthrough.
Then, while 35% of all Americans will experience poverty at least once over the course of a 4-year period, fewer than 3% of us will be consistently poor over that 4-year period.
While I was there, I collected images and inspiration.
Whereas, поскольку, несмотря на...
Whereas the people who are selling us the higher stuff, the therapists, the poets, are on their own and they have no power, they have no might.
Us viewing and listening and consuming the product, whereas theatre is just straight away, it's like that.
Whereas liberals begin with the individual and an individual with its rights in order to think about what a society can and cannot do to the individual.
Unlike, в отличие от...
Unlike Socrates, who felt that the invention of writing would atrophy our brains because we wouldn't have to remember anything if we wrote it down, so too people worry that today's technologies are going to atrophy part of our brain and limit what it means to be human. But
unlike the settled middle-class suburbs whose existence I was oblivious of, there was no sense of entitlement in Footscray.
And unlike the dinosaurs, we can do something about it.
И напоследок хочется сказать, что эти фразы, для того, чтобы они пришли в речь, нужно использовать прямо поначалу искусственно, то есть добавлять свои мысли, добавлять свои тексты, добавлять свою речь, прямо специально, насильно. Потом, через некоторое время, эти слова натурально придут в речь, просто они будут всплывать в нужный момент. Но чтобы фраза из незнакомой стала знакомой, все-таки нужно постараться и контролировать употребление этих фраз поначалу искусственно.